In still more versions of the legend, he's like a bit of a harasser and won't leave her alone. They capture the imagination, they've got the supernatural, they've got big fights. She cheats on Arthur with his son Mordred and agrees to marry him whilst Arthur's away fighting. Hi, I'm Hetta Howes. I'm a senior lecturer in medieval literature at City St George's, University of London. I'm an expert in medieval literature and history, and I'm here with History Hit today to see if I can answer Google's most popular questions about King Arthur. So we can put me to the test.
All right, is it a hit or a miss, History Hit? Love the little sword there. She seems lovely, but we'll have to see. We'll judge by what she says.
Was King Arthur real? Start with the biggest question and the hardest one to answer in any kind of discussion of King Arthur. The answer is probably no. There's lots of reason to believe that Arthur was pretty much a fictional character. However,
yeah, before she goes into the deep, however, I would like to say, I mean, it's a fantasy legend. I do believe, though, that it might be based on some truth. And I think that that's something that happens with a lot of legends and a lot of stories and a lot of tales that we get from the past, that sometimes, yes, they're embellished. Yes, they add a lot of stuff. I mean, it's not like I'm actually believing that there was a wizard by the name of Merlin who was actually able to cast spells. With that being said, oftentimes there is a layer of truth. And then from something perhaps even ancient at times, perhaps not the case here, but it's possible that a high medieval tale had as a foundation an early medieval real historical person.
We do get some references to him in early, particularly Welsh chronicles, history chronicles. So the first time Arthur is mentioned by name in a history chronicle is by a guy called Nennius, a Welsh monk writing in the 800s. He writes a history of Britain, and he mentions a man called Arturus or Arthur. And this guy is a warlord, he fights in battles, but we don't really get much else. And the fact that a predecessor of Nennius called Gildas, who writes a lot of history from the time King Arthur is placed, doesn't mention Arthur is a little bit suspect. Bede also doesn't mention Arthur. After Nennius was writing, we do get sort of various more and more references to King Arthur, which are fleshed out in more and more prominence.
Hey, look at all these gentlemen with their flowy hair. I mean, it's still short compared to mine, but at least I feel like I belong.
So Geoffrey of Monmouth writes a history of the kings of Britain, and he gives this character Arthur his sort of king status, he gives him more backstory, and this snowballs and becomes the Arthurian legends we know and love today. But in terms of sort of definitive historical evidence of a man called King Arthur who was a king at all, at the time period that King Arthur is normally placed, we don't really have any evidence of that. All right, second question, who was King Arthur? So whether King Arthur was real or not, there's some sort of particular ideas about King Arthur that we find in lots of different sources. So King Arthur was the son of Uther Pendragon and a woman called Igraine. His parentage is a little bit dodgy. So according to the legend, we've got this king or warlord, I should say, in the 5th or 6th centuries called Uther Pendragon, and he falls completely in love with a woman called Igraine who is married to somebody else, the Duke of Cornwall. Now Merlin, who is another character in Arthurian legend, he works with Uther to disguise Uther's appearance so Uther looks like his enemy, and Igraine sleeps with him thinking that it's her husband, and thus Arthur is conceived. So some slightly unfortunate parentage for Arthur. In almost all the early references we get to Arthur, he exists in around the sort of 5th or 6th centuries in this space of time that we know actually very little about in history, when the Roman Empire has withdrawn from Britain and there's a lot of infighting, sort of Saxons coming in, various different battles, and we don't know a lot about this time period. And a lot of people think that actually Arthur was inserted into this time period because it was so shrouded in mystery and complexity, and it's sort of a good story to fill in that gap.
It is a good possibility, and we have to take it into account. It is also possible that he did exist, but once again, just like we don't have a lot of historical information on this period, the evidence was also gone. So I don't really completely dismiss, neither does she, but in fact I'm agreeing with her, but I don't completely dismiss the possibility that eventually we will find something and we'll be like, okay, that's it. This definitively prove that King Arthur was based on a real historical king by the name of Arthur. It could happen. It could be a case.
Always a great fighter, so he fights off quite famously the Saxons. He fights in Rome. He almost marches on Rome in one of the legends. And he is famous for sort of bringing Britain together, but also carving out an empire overseas. He actually only becomes King Arthur in a text by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So in the early mentions, he's a warlord,
Right.
but Geoffrey of Monmouth famously makes him a king, probably to appeal to his readership, who would have understood the idea of a king a little bit better. What was King Arthur king of? So
Camelot.
King Arthur is king of Britain in the legend. So he's king of sort of England, Wales, Scotland, parts of Ireland. He also, according to some of the legends, actually is king of parts of overseas. So he takes over, for example, Gaul in the Roman Empire. The idea is that King Arthur wants to make his kingdom as great and as expansive as possible. At the time that a lot of these legends are being written, the idea of a good king was someone who could expand and conquer,
Right.
colonize basically. So King Arthur is king of Britain, but also elsewhere. However, he becomes particularly associated in later legends, sometimes with England by English writers. Originally, he has a lot of associations with Wales.
Yeah.
So the first few writers that mention him are actually Welsh chroniclers. And even now today in Wales, there's a lot of different places that are supposedly linked with King Arthur. Caerleon in Wales is supposed to be where Camelot was, his sort of stronghold, his
Man, that's a fascinating thought.